All right. I don't remember what the syllabus actually said for today. I know there's going to be some kind of lecture, life and times. Yeah. We'll probably plan to start Richard III on Tuesday when we come back. So read the first three acts definitely, as I said yesterday or Tuesday, whatever day it was. If you can't read the whole play, read the whole play before that, because that'll just be helpful. Because I'll probably get all this background done, all this background stuff done today. Okay? So there's a lot of dates, and they're all important. And there's a lot of dates I haven't even included that are also important that, I might come back and add in later. So this is kind of just the background, the historical milieu in which Shakespeare was born, grew up, thrived, and died. Okay? Not as much about his dying. So let's back up, because we got to go back before we can even talk about Shakespeare. We've got to talk about the political context of his life and times. And that political context doesn't begin with his birth. It doesn't even begin with the beginning of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. You got to go back to the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. Okay? Elizabeth is a Tudor. So it goes back to her grandfather. 1485. In 1485, we have what's called the Battle of Bosworth Field. Bosworth is a field in northwest England. The exact location is not known, but you can go to a spot in northwest England and they say, we're pretty sure this is where it occurred. Okay? And in that battle, Henry Tudor, okay, of the House of Lancaster, defeated Richard, Duke of York, King Richard III of England. Okay? Now, it's important that I mention House of Lancaster, House of York. Why? Because this is the English Wars of the Roses. And your introduction goes into this. I don't remember which page number exactly. They're called the Wars of the Roses because there's an emblem for each family. And it's a rose. One is a white rose. One is a pink or red rose. Okay? And I always forget which. And I don't think I'm looking at the right page. Yes. Lancasters wore the red rose, and the Yorks wore the white rose. Okay? So Lancaster, red rose, York's white rose. Okay? So, Henry Tudor, Duke of Lancaster, defeats, essentially cousin, Richard III, who's the King of England. And in that play that we'll start talking about next week, one of the climactic scenes is when Shakespeare puts in the mouth of Richard III, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. He's at the Battle of Bosworth. He's getting slaughtered, and he wants me to leave. Okay? Interesting little tidbit. Historically, after this battle, Richard III dies. Okay, I'm going to give away something, obviously, from the play. Richard III dies at Bosworth Field, and nobody knows what happened to his body. He's a king. He ought to get some kind of formal, burial. But he doesn't. Okay? His body gets buried anonymously. Until 2012, in the town of Leicester. It's pronounced Leicester, not Leicester. Okay? Leicester. They're doing infrastructure work for a new, what's called over there, car park, we call parking lot. Okay? And they discover the foundations of a medieval building that they didn't know was there. Okay? So, excavation stops, archaeologists are brought in. And this happens every time somebody wants to build a parking lot in England. They always have to bring in archaeologists because, lo and behold, there's a Roman ruin, or there's this, or there's that. Just the other day, it was announced the largest single hoard of, I think it is silver coins from just around the time of the Norman Conquest. Over 2,000 coins were discovered somewhere in Somerset. Metal detectors out having fun in some field, and they just start pulling up silver coins. So, they do this. They discover the foundations of a medieval ruin, so they start excavating that. Lo and behold, in this foundation, they find a lead casket. Lead implies the person who's buried inside the casket has got to be somewhat important or wealthy. Most people, if they got a casket at all, would be wood, and it would be gone by now. Okay? They open the lid of the casket, and there's a guy there, there's a skeleton there, with a spine. Your spine should look like this. Well, his spine looks like this. Modern day diagnosis, he suffers from what? It's a male. Scoliosis. Bent spine. Catch that early enough, grow up with a brace, and you can get it corrected. Okay? His wasn't, obviously. His spine was so bent that if he had stood erect, I think it was something like he would have been about 5'10", which is fairly tall for the Middle Ages, 5'9". But because of this, he was like this. Now, notice, right shoulder's up a little, left shoulder's down a little, and I'm hunched. According to Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard III, he's a hunchback. It's called the Hunchback King. Okay? That's never good, by the way, in the Middle Ages or in medieval literature. You don't want to be hunchback. Series of novels written by a current writer. The guy's a PhD in both English and law. Started off his life as a barrister in England, and then he went back and got it wasn't a PhD in English, it was a history degree. C.J. Sansom is his name. He's written a series of novels, and they're collectively just called the Shard Lake series or novels. Their protagonist is a guy named, last name, Shardlake. He's Jewish. Wait, is that right? No, he's not Jewish. He's hunchback. Literal hunchback. And a lawyer. Two, black marks against you in terms of Elizabethan England. And they're all set in the time of Henry VIII and just after. The very latest one just came out, I think, either earlier this year or last year, and it's set during the reign of Edward VI. The previous 6, I think, are all set in the reign of Henry VIII. And these aren't little novels. These are like 600-700 pages each. And the guy has captured Elizabethan and Henrician England very, very well, because he studied the maps, he's read all the primary documents, and you get the whole feeling. So if you're interested in that period, I highly recommend these. Okay? Anyways, Shakespeare gives us our modern interpretation of Richard III. Okay? So Richard dies, gets buried anonymously. His body is found in 2012. They do DNA tests, and lo and behold, it is Richard III. So once they determine that it's Richard III, they have to determine, okay, now what do we do with him? They can't bury him back where he was, because that's going to be a parking lot. That's, you don't pave over dead people. You move them and then pave the ground, okay? So there becomes this big debate. What kind of reinterment does he receive? Does he get a state funeral? I mean, he's a former king. He doesn't get a state funeral. But the Ricardian Society, which is a society dedicated to the memory of Richard III, they raise funds, and he gets buried, reburied, I believe it is, in the cathedral in Leicester. And that was just, this was 2012, that was like 2015, 2016. He just kind of, bones were in limbo until then. Okay? Nobody, again, for over 500 years, had any idea where he was. So, Richard III is defeated. Henry Tudor becomes King Henry VII. Lots of Henrys. Okay? Just prior to Richard III, you had Henry VI. In fact, Henry VI served as king more than once. What do I mean by that? I mean, he was king, and then he wasn't king for a while, and then he came back to be king. And Richard III, I don't think he was murdered. I think he died. I'd have to check that. Right? And Henry VII becomes king. Now, jump from here for a second to over here. Just a brief chronology, the English kings, monarchs, during and just before, going after Shakespeare's death. So, he becomes king 1485. He rules until 1509. And in 1509, he dies. Okay. Henry VIII becomes king. Henry VIII is not Henry VII's eldest son, though. Henry VIII had an eldest brother. His name was Arthur. But he died before he could become king. He died at like 19. Okay. Here's the interesting little kicker that becomes a huge problem later on. Henry VIII's elder brother, Arthur, and I don't remember the date, Arthur married Catherine of Aragon when he was like 17, 18. But then he died. I mean, they were only married 6 months or so. Okay? Why is this important? Because Henry marries Catherine of Aragon too. Earlier in 1530, in the 1520s. Okay? We'll talk about why and what happens in a moment. So, Henry VIII becomes king, 1509. He rules until 1546. Now, when he becomes king, he's not the fat, slobbering, grotesque Henry VIII that you see pictures of today. He was essentially Chris Hemsworth. He was young, he was built, he was hot. He was big, physically big, menacing, not big like he became in the 1540s, so big where you had to use a crane to lift him onto his horse. Okay? You can go to the Tower of London and you can look at Henry's armor. You can look at Henry's armor from when he was like 18, it's, Mr. Incredible, to just before his death, and it looks like a potbelly stove. I mean, it's literally 2 or 3 of us could fit in there. Okay? But he dies in 1546. Now, when he dies, he has 3 children. Each of them by a different wife. Each of them regarded by the other and many of the people as illegitimate. They're all half siblings. They don't like each other. Christmas and Thanksgiving just had to be fun. Go to Hampton Court Palace, and you can see this wonderful portrait. And it's, Henry's in the middle, and there's Edward, I think either on his knee or standing beside him. Okay? And there's Mary, slightly off to the side in the background, kind of. And there's Elizabeth, also slightly off to the side and in the background. All 3 children are present, but only the son is right, next to the king. Okay? So he dies. Who becomes monarch? Eldest child? No. Eldest son. Why? Because of the laws of primogeniture, which hold the laws of primogeniture. Eldest son becomes monarch. Doesn't matter how many elder sisters that son may have. Eldest son becomes monarch. Those laws hold sway until, what was it? Less than 10 years ago. Because Wills, future King of England, Charles's eldest son, I think it was at his instigation, he got it pushed through so that after he dies as king, his eldest child, Charlotte, will become monarch. His eldest son, Georgie, is screwed. He only becomes king if, what, good Shakespearean fashion, bumps off his older sister. Okay? Harry, he's completely out of the picture because Will's got like 3 kids now. Not to say it hasn't happened in the past that they all meet an untimely end. So, Edward becomes king at the age of 10. How powerful is a 10-year-old? Nope. Why? Because there is a Lord Protector. He's going to protect Edward's interests, which really means Edward becomes a puppet. Now, Edward does have some power. Edward can essentially fire the Lord Protector, okay, because there is a Privy Council. The Privy Council does answer to the Lord Protector, but they do also have to take into account what the king says. But the Lord Protector is really the one who's powerful. Edward dies 7 years later, 16, 17 years old. He's in ill health most of his life. And his eldest sister becomes queen, Mary. Okay? Edward is Protestant. We're going to get back to the Protestant Reformation in a moment. Mary is a thoroughgoing, dyed-in-the-wool, ring-kissing papist, to use the terminology they would have used. Okay? They meaning non-Catholics. She's entirely Catholic. In fact, she's so Catholic, what does she start to do to Protestants? Almost immediately, yeah. She starts executing them. There are Protestants who are burned at the stake, hung and burned at the stake, hung, drawn and quartered, head from the body, arms and legs from the torso, and you send parts to various parts of the country, kind of as a little warning. Or head just on, Traitor's Gate in the Tower of London. Or head on some other gate, Bishop's Gate in London. So that as people travel by, hey, look, there's so-and-so, the dirty Protestant kind of a thing. Okay? She dies in 1558. The youngest of Henry VIII's children, that are still alive, obviously, Elizabeth becomes queen. Okay? That's E1, because we do get another one. Elizabeth II, who's been monarch since, 1953? Elizabeth II is now the longest reigning English monarch in English history. Go back to the earliest of the English kings. Even before the Norman Conquest, she outdoes them all. She's been, 66 years? She just won't die. Okay. Charles is just going, come on, Mom. Charles, why couldn't you have been in car with Dad? So, 1558, and Prince Philip's still around. 1558, she becomes queen. She dies in 1603. Unmarried. According to the lore, still a virgin. The Virgin Queen, from which we get 2 state names, Virginia and West Virginia. Okay? Not likely from what we do know. She dies in 1603, and after a little period of time, sometimes this is given as 1604, 1603, 1604, a new monarch is investured. called the investiture process. James VI of Scotland comes down and becomes James I of England. Okay? He does have a legal claim to the throne. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was related to Henry VIII. Don't remember exactly how, but that was the relation. He was a cousin of Elizabeth. Elizabeth didn't have any children. Okay? That's why they assume, oh, she's a woman, no children, must be a virgin, therefore. Not how it works. Okay, back up a little bit. So that's the king. Shakespeare, born 64, dies 1616. So he dies during just about the middle, almost the exact middle of James I's reign. Okay, so let's back up. Bosworth Field, Henry VII dies, Henry VIII becomes king, and over on the continent, there is a Augustinian monk, Catholic monk, who is having a crisis of conscience. He's having problems with some of what he is hearing from the Catholic Church and from purveyors of Catholic indulgences. Okay. Martin Luther, Augustinian monk, having issues with Catholic dogma and doctrine, and specifically confession. He goes to his priest for confession, his abbot. He says confession, and he walks out, and he thinks, oops, forgot one. Got to go back in. And while he's confessing, oops, a sin occurs in his mind. Well, there's something else. So he's having issues with how can I really confess and be absolved, etc. Meanwhile, this man named John Tetzel, comes into town selling indulgences. I'll explain what indulgences are in a minute. And he has a nice little ditty, a little song that he sings. The moment the coin in the coffer clinks, the soul from purgatory springs. Okay? Because indulgences are pieces of paper that you could purchase from the church through the seller of indulgences that would cut the time down that a loved one would have to serve in purgatory. How does that happen? Because when Jesus died on the cross, according to the doctrine of indulgences, he deposited a huge amount in the heavenly bank account, so to speak. That's a bank account that the seller of indulgences, a.k.a. the Catholic Church, a.k.a. the Pope, can draw on. Okay? I want to make a withdrawal. Well, how do you do that? Give me $20. For $20, you can have this. This is a drawing on that. What's it draw, though? It doesn't draw money. It draws time out of purgatory. For who? For the person you buy the indulgence for. So let's say, I know my father is in purgatory. My dad's still alive. Use my mom. Let's say I know my mom is in purgatory. Because while she was a saintly woman, she wasn't perfect. And you only go to heaven if you're perfect. Everybody else goes to purgatory or hell. Hell's a no-brainer. You don't get a get out of there. There's no, get out of hell card in the game of Monopoly of Life. So, I can buy an indulgence for a loved one that reduces the amount of time they spend in purgatory. Maybe their amount of time, if you read Dante's comedy, kind of discussing here a little. maybe the amount of time they gain is 5,000 years. Well, 20 years may not sound like a lot, but I'm sure after 4,980 years, that 20 years would really be nice. Okay? What else can I use an indulgence for? I can buy an indulgence for me. I can buy an indulgence for a sin I've not yet committed. Now that's your get out of jail free card. Because I can walk down the street and I can say, it's a nice horse. I think I'd like that horse. I've got to get out of purgatory indulgence for stealing horses. Okay, stealing horses. Unless you're in the Wild West, that's not so bad. It can be for rape. It could be for murder. It could be for theft. It could be for blasphemy. It could be for any number of things. It's so-and-so gets out of purgatory X number of years. Okay? That didn't sit well with Luther. He had real problems with that, as I think most people would. Theologically, he had huge issues with that. Okay? He also had a political problem. Where's the money going for the sale of indulgences? Okay, these are being bought and sold in Germany. Make Germany great again. Where's it going? It's going to Rome. For what purpose? Every Easter, what does the Pope do? He celebrates Mass, and then he comes out on the balcony of the royal apartment, of the papal apartments, overlooking St. Peter's Basilica. That's what it's going to build St. Peter's Basilica. Luther's like, if we're going to sell these rotten pieces of paper, let's at least keep the money in Germany. Let's keep it home. Let's build something here with it. So, all kinds of issues. So what happens? On October 31st, All Hallows Eve, okay, Luther does what? What is with all these stupid little bugs? Infested room. Louder?
He nails the, I can't remember what they're called, to the door.
He nails, thank you, 95 theses to the church door in Wittenberg. 95. You're going to have a hard enough time coming up with one for a major paper for this. He comes up with 95 different points of debate. I don't remember off the top of my head. I used to know them all. I don't remember off the top of my head what any one of them is. But I think one is, what's the ultimate authority? Is it the Bible? Is it the church? Do I really need to go to a priest in order to be absolved? Can't I just go to Jesus in prayer? Do I really need a church? Do we need icons in churches? Do we need crosses in churches? Do we need all this stuff? 95 points. What's he want to do? He wants you to have an argument. Not for the sake of argument. He wants to clean up problems. He doesn't want to divide the church. He doesn't want to break the church. He wants to correct the church, to clean the church. Okay? But nobody agrees to a debate. The bishop won't come, the priest won't come. Okay? So, he breaks his holy orders. He no longer remains a monk. And just to show how thoroughly he breaks it, he gets married. Okay? And has sex and lots of kids. That's how we know the one follows the other. What else does he do? Well, these 95 theses get copied. How copied? By hand? Maybe. I don't know about you, but if I've got a printer, I'm not going to copy stuff by hand. And go back a little bit, around 1453, a guy named, I'll use his anglicized name, John Gutenberg creates the movable printing press in Germany. China had movable type before this, not like the printing press, but movable type. So what does that mean? Well, the printing press, you can set a whole page of type and you can run off a whole bunch of copies. And then set another page, run off a whole bunch of copies. It makes books readily available. It makes single sheet documents readily available. Guess what? You can put these 95 theses on a single page in really small type. And they did. And they got copied and it got handed around and people are, yeah, I don't like this. I'm going to go talk to a priest about, who I'm having sex with. Doesn't, none of their business. Or who I'm, stealing, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens? That fire just spreads. It's the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Protestant protestors. They are protesting against the authority, the dogma, the practice, all that kind of stuff of the Catholic Church. Okay? 1521 rolls around. Meanwhile, Luther's not quiet. He's still writing. He's writing biblical commentaries. He's writing things against the Pope, calling the Pope the Antichrist. I mean, when he turns, he doesn't just, go all meek and mild. He goes the other way. Okay? So, in 1521, Luther is invited to a meeting. It's called the Diet of Worms. Diet is not diet. Diet means meeting of. Okay? You're going to see when we get to Hamlet, Shakespeare's going to pun on this. He's going to talk about when the character Polonius is dead, he's at a certain convocation of worms. A diet is a convocation. Like MTSU has every fall, the Sunday before classes begin. Everybody what? Is called, that's the vocation from vocare, con, together. We're all called together. Okay? So there's a calling together. And Luther is invited. He's invited because they're going to talk about these 95 theses. They're going to talk about the points he wants to talk about. And he's like, cool, finally. But he's not stupid either. He says, I need a guarantee of safe passage. That is, I need to know that I will arrive there safely. Somebody's not going to waylay me on the road. And I will be able to leave safely. I'm not going to get there and suddenly be locked up and, all KGB, just disappear forever, so to speak. And the Holy Roman Emperor says, cool, agreed. Luther goes to the Diet of Worms. He's expecting a debate. He's expecting that he's essentially going to be sitting on one side of the table, and there's going to be all these other brilliant theologians on another side of the table, and they're going to hammer out truth, so to speak. Instead, he gets there, and he finds everything he has written since 1517, all stacked on a table. Here's what they're going to debate. Take it all back. That's not a debate. That's an ultimatum. Take it all back. Luther, a little bit blindsided, says, give me 24 hours. Let me pray about this. And they're like, cool, you're Christian, we're Christians, fine, pray. So he goes off, he prays, he comes back the next day. And according to the anecdotal account of what happened, anecdotal, somebody who was there said this is what happened. Luther stands next to that pile of writings and essentially puts his hand on it and says, unless proven to me in Holy Scripture or reason or by my conscience. So, unless you can prove to me from the Bible, from logic, or you can prove to my conscience that I'm wrong, here I stand. I can do no other. That is, every word I wrote, I stand behind. You want me to take it back? Ain't gonna happen. He was given free passage. So he leaves. disappears. Thought that he's kidnapped. He is kind of kidnapped. He's kidnapped by his friends who put him up in a castle somewhere, and he starts to translate the Bible. He translates the Bible from the Latin Vulgate to German. What kind of German? Some idealized form of German, like the King James Version. King James Version of the Bible is intentionally archaic. It's at least 50 years out of date. Okay? Why? Because it sounds better. My cup runneth over. Sounds much better than my cup's overfull or my cup's full. Okay? So he starts translating it into everyday, ordinary, common German. Why? So that the everyday, ordinary, common German who can read it in his own language or her own language. Why? Because a motto develops. I can never remember all of these, so maybe I will today. Sola Scriptura, Sola Fides, Sola Gratia. Scripture alone, faith alone, grace alone. That becomes the motto, essentially, of the Protestant Reformation. What's it mean? Me and the Bible can find our way. I don't need anybody else. I don't need a priest. I don't need a preacher. I don't need an interpreter. If I have the Bible in my own language, that's all I need. What else do I need? Faith alone. Alone. Without what? Works. That big old bank account, that's all based on the doctrine of works, Luther argued. Okay, it's Jesus' works, but it's irrelevant. It's, being a good person. Nope, doesn't count for squat. You got to have faith. Grace alone. Again, that's part of the works. Okay? Doesn't matter how good you are. You can be Mother Teresa times a million. And helping all the poor, all the needy, all the hungry, all the sick, all the naked, all those, everything Jesus talks about in Matthew 25, Luther essentially said, that's not important. As long as you have faith and God has shown grace upon you, that's what's important. I think Calvin's going to take that. John Calvin's going to take that, and he's going to kind of amp it up on steroids a bit. Okay? So, that's Luther. That's, the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. In the mid-1520s, I don't have it down here, but in the mid-1520s, Henry VIII writes a tract against Luther. And the Pope, who's Leo at this time, I don't remember which, Leo names Henry, pretty ironic here, defender of the faith. And then just a few years later, he gets labeled a heretic. Defender of the faith. In 1530, Henry divorces his wife Catherine. Why? We can marry. Which one is it? Not Anne Boleyn. Maybe it is Anne Boleyn. Or it's the other Catherine. I can't remember. Too many wives. I mean, I've had one for almost 35 years. I can't imagine having 6. He divorces Catherine, but he doesn't want it to be called a divorce. Actually, he wants it as an annulment. Why? What's the difference between a divorce and an annulment?
It also acknowledges that the wedding happened. Annulment says...
You're really close, Bjorn. It's not that the wedding happened, it's that the marriage was consummated. They had sex. Okay? Well, actually, I rephrase it. He doesn't ask for annulment. He does want the divorce. And he wants the divorce because his wife had been married previously to his elder brother. Didn't seem to be a problem when he married her. But when he married her, the argument was they had never consummated their marriage. That Arthur, here, and Catherine never had sex. They never consummated the marriage. The word consummation, It's the same word that we have in the Latin version of the New Testament at the end of Christ's life. He hanging on the cross, they give him the vinegar with, stuff, and he says, consummatum est. It is finished. It doesn't just mean that's the end, turn the page. It means completed, perfected. Okay? So the marriage consummation is completed, perfected, through the act of intercourse after the vows. What are the vows? They're the beginning of the process. It doesn't matter if the vows aren't completed. So he said their vows weren't completed, therefore we can get married. Now, because she hasn't borne him a child, a male child, he says it doesn't count. So I want a divorce. Pope obviously says, no, you can't get a divorce. That's, you've got a child. Mary is her daughter, if I remember correctly. So a few years later, he declares himself the supreme head of the English church. Just kind of willy-nilly, wakes up one morning, I think it'd be nice to be the English Pope. Makes himself Pope of the English Church. That's the beginning of the Anglican/Episcopal Church. Okay? 1536, I've got Tyndale mentioned and dissolution. Who's Tyndale? William Tyndale is a Bible translator. He's been working on the Bible. Henry has him hunted down, captured, thrown into prison in the Netherlands, and eventually he's executed. Why? For translating the Bible into English. And then Henry takes Tyndale's translation and he essentially approves it. And it becomes the first major kind of English translation. Miles Coverdale's version is between these years. Okay? Dissolution. Dissolution refers to what's called the dissolution of the monasteries. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's right-hand man, comes up with an idea to help finance Henry's wars, primarily against France. He's always at war with France. Okay? And this great idea is, see, you're head of the church, right? Yeah, I'm head of the church. So that means all that property theoretically belongs to you, right? Now there's an idea. Why? Because the church owns about 50% of all the land in England. So, what they start to do, and the church includes monasteries and abbeys and things like that. So what they start to do is they start to sell off monastic properties to the highest bidders. Most of those highest bidders are people who want to suck up to Henry. Okay? So if you go to England today and you visit, I used to take, when I taught my Harry Potter course in London, we'd go to Laycock Abbey, which is in southwest England, Wiltshire, near Stonehenge. We go to Laycock Abbey. It's a beautiful place, but it's fallen apart. Why? Because during the dissolution of the monasteries, it was sold. And when it was sold, what the guy who initially bought it did is he started to take brick and block from the monastery to build himself a nice big house. So when you go to Laycock Abbey today, you've got the Fox Talbot Museum in the big house and the monastery. The big house didn't used to be there. The big house was built from stone from the monastery. So the monastery, you go in and it looks like somebody went at it on the inside with a chisel and hammer. And that's exactly what happened. Okay? Go to Lindisfarne Abbey. Same kind of thing. Go to Tintern Abbey. Any of you, have had the Romantics and you've studied William Wordsworth. He writes this beautiful poem, Ode, Intimations on Immortality, written above Tintern Abbey. He's looking down to the ruins of this beautiful abbey. Well, they're ruins not because of, Satanists, atheists, Vikings, etc., but because of Henry VIII. Okay? Selling off all this monastic property. Well, what else happens during that? Well, two things that happen as a result. One, humanly, okay, talk about people as human beings, etc., really horrible. The other one, culturally, really horrible. Talk about the human aspect first. What happens to all the monks who lived in those abbeys and monasteries? They get thrown out on the street. Literally. They get thrown out. They're not provided for by any means. They're not given a government pension. Right? They're literally thrown out. Okay? So they automatically become homeless. At the very same time as Henry and Parliament are passing laws, I mean, you think, Trump and Republicans are horrible, passing laws against being poor or homeless, making it illegal to be poor. Wrap your head around that for a bit. So if you can't pay your bills, what happens? You get thrown into the poorhouse where you're expected to pay off your debt. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Doesn't quite work, okay? So one of my colleagues actually wrote an article about, I can't remember which Shakespeare play. One of Shakespeare's plays where Shakespeare mentions, the fact about how the poor are treated by the laws. I mean, it's in a fictitious context. Why? Because Shakespeare has to be careful. Queen Elizabeth is not a nice person. She has people's tongues cut out. She has her hands cut off. She has her heads chopped off for saying unnice things about her. Okay? And Henry is what? Papa. Now, they didn't have this great loving relationship, But anyway. So that's the human aspect of the dissolution of the monasteries. Okay? The cultural aspect, every monastery has what along with it? I mean, what's the purpose of a monastery? Monks and or nuns who gather together for prayer. There's a church associated. What do the monks do? How do the monks make their living? Because even if you're in a monastery, you got to make a living somehow. Bread doesn't just magically fall from heaven like it did for the Hebrews. Agriculture, possibly. Some monks today make really good beer in the Netherlands, wine, bread, candles. I know of monks in monasteries. I'm Orthodox. I know of monks in monasteries, Mount Athos, Greece, and Mount Sinai, and they make incense and all that kind of stuff. What else?
Scribes.
Louder?
Scribes.
They're scribes. That is, they scribe. They write. Well, what do they write? Potboiler, dirty, raunchy sex novels? No. They copy things. They're copyists. Well, what are they copying? Books and books. You want a copy of a book, you take it to a monastery. And the monastery will produce that copy. You won't get it tomorrow. You won't get it next week. It might be next year, depending upon the size of the book. Why? Copying a book is extremely tedious work. You got to start with what? Out in the field. You got to kill a cow, preferably a calf. Why? The skin's a lot softer. But not just one. It takes a lot of cattle to create a book. Okay? So you have to kill it, slaughter it, clean the skin, prepare the skin, cut the skin to size. Then you got to mix your pigments. Then you got to have your text in front of you. And then you got to decide, well, how many pages will this text take? Because maybe I'm using smaller pages. And you got to calculate all that and work it all out. And then you start the copying process. And you got to make sure if it's a really important book, you don't make mistakes. So you're very careful. It could be a year, maybe more, for the production of that. So, because monasteries produced books, they also had books. They had libraries. What happens to those libraries? They're destroyed for the most part. Why? Well, the part of the process of this is the anti-English Catholic thought system. Well, so you got these ring-kissing papists. We're going to kick them out on the streets, you know. But what are we going to do with the stuff the ring-kissing papists read? That's obviously ring-kissing papist-making material. Get rid of it. So, take a manuscript made out of vellum. It's got ink on it. And do what? Pull your knife out, scrape that ink off, and voila. You have new writing material. That's one thing that happened. Take those manuscripts apart, totally apart, so that where you have groups of pages together, think of, something like this. Take them apart so you have not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pages. Take them all apart so that you have this and this, and because it's stiff material, that could become new binding on a book. I've actually, when I was first to London, 1995, went to Oxford, and at that point, some of the booksellers still had a bit of old stuff. And I went this one place. I mean, it was a trash pit. Just a hellhole. Stunk when you walked in it because of mold and mildew. And this guy literally had, floor to ceiling, just shelves full of crap. And beneath the bottom shelf would be boxes. You rummage around, and I remember rummage around through a couple, and there's a book with a medieval vellum manuscript cover. Because the top would be blank. I'd open it up, and I could see where the paper, like in here, where the paper had been glued to the vellum, I could see the medieval script. That thing could have been, that page, could have been from the 13th century. Okay? So, manuscripts get destroyed, get lost. We've got information of piles of them being burned. This is probably why we have one copy today of Beowulf. We have one copy today of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Probably why we have only one copy of most of the major poems and stories of the Middle Ages. It's estimated that probably 90% of what was written from 400 AD to roughly 1400 AD is gone. A large portion of that because of this. So I don't really like Henry VIII. Leaving him the human aspect, just what he did for literature. Okay? So that's the dissolution of the monastery. 1551, notice this is during the reign of Edward VI. You get the 42 articles. These are 42 kind of important things of belief by Archbishop Cranmer, Archbishop of the Anglican Church. These are 42 rules of faith, 42 things you got to believe. All right? This is kind of the beginnings of a more formalized, more stringent Protestantism. Because when Henry does this, he's merely changing names. When Henry does this in 1534, he doesn't automatically, along with that, say, oh, and by the way, Mary's no longer to be referred to as the Queen of Heaven. Mary is no longer to be prayed to. You can no longer pray to saints. You can no longer worship or have icons or religious imagery in your churches, etc. Doesn't do any of that. Starting in 1536 with Thomas Cromwell's influence, however, because Cromwell is a dyed-in-the-wool Protestant. I mean, he's really severe, so to speak. Okay? Edward, he's kind of middle of the roadish, but those advising him and controlling him, they're less middle of the road. Okay? So, during Edward's reign, you've got a pretty strong shift to more robust, let me put it that way, it's not pejorative, to a robust form of Protestantism. But as I said, he dies. Mary becomes queen, and she reverses track. She changes, turns everything upside down. Now, we have a Catholic monarch. So, now, if you're openly, outspokenly Protestant, and one of the things that a lot of Protestants were openly, outspokenly about was, as John Knox, a Calvinist preacher in Scotland, put it, the monstrous regiment and rule of women. Why? Because he was dealing with Mary, Queen of Scots, at the same time as England was dealing with Mary, Queen of England. And Mary, Queen of Scots was Catholic also. Right? So she's, rounding up Protestants and burning them at the stake and stuff. She dies, Elizabeth becomes queen. And Elizabeth asks the famous Rodney King kind of question. Can't we just all get along? Really? Do we have to kill each other in the name of Jesus to show who loves Jesus the most by killing the most of the other side? No, we can't. Because pretty soon, after she becomes queen, Parliament, with her acceptance, starts to pass some laws restricting religious freedom. Essentially, when Elizabeth becomes queen, she follows the Bill Clinton rule from 1994, dealing with gays in the military. Anybody remember? Don't ask, don't tell. I won't ask you what your religious affiliation is. Don't tell me. If you're celebrating the Mass on Sunday, do it quietly. If I don't know, that's fine. What's the problem? If I do know, now we have a problem. Okay? So one of the laws, for example, that Parliament passes in, when is this? Mid-1560s, I believe it is. It's when Shakespeare's dad is still essentially running the show in Stratford. Parliament says religious imagery and iconography in churches must be destroyed. Or, if not destroyed, painted over. Okay? So let's say one wall of the church has an image of the crucifixion. So you've got Christ hanging there on the cross, you've got Mary down at his feet, you've got John comforting Mary, you've got the other Marys there, you got the centurion maybe holding out the chalice to capture the blood, the Holy Grail myth, all that kind of stuff. What's the purpose of that imagery? Is it to worship the paint on the plaster? No. It's to draw your attention to what? What the paint on the plaster is representing, the crucifixion itself. But for the Protestants in Parliament, you can't have that. Thou shalt have no graven image. Okay? Paint it, cover it up. So what that meant for some churches, for some towns, was, for some Protestants, these stained glass windows, golly gee, those are pretty. Get rid of them. Destroy them. There's only about 3, if I remember right, 3 or 4 whole windows in England that survive from before 1550. Because after Parliament did this, and after the dissolution of the monasteries, because the monasteries contained a lot of these windows, okay, they were destroyed. So, for example, to bring Shakespeare back into it, his father, because he was the enforcer in town, his father followed the letter of the law. It had to be covered up. They didn't say how well it had to be covered up. So if you go to the Guildhall Church in Stratford today, you can see where the area over the altar has been whitewashed. But you can also see under the whitewash. That is, the image still shows through. Now you can see in other parts of the church where the whitewashing has since been removed. so that you can see, full Technicolor brilliance, the kind of imagery that some of these churches have. If you go to that abbey that I mentioned earlier, Laycock Abbey, you can go into parts of it and you can see where plaster remains on the wall, where it hasn't been chipped away. You can see the outlines of images, like of angels. Okay? Go to Westminster Abbey, go to the chapter room, and you can see some of these. I mean, it's totally amazing. Go to the remains of the abbey at Battle, outside Hastings, that William the Conqueror had built to, one, celebrate his defeat of Harold Godwinson, but also to, pray to God for his own soul for having killed Harold Godwinson, rightful king of England and such. And you can see snippets. But even that abbey is almost entirely gone because of the dissolution of the monasteries. Okay? So that's that removing of religious imagery and symbolism, that happens largely in the churches, at least, during Elizabeth's reign. John had to do it. Now, your author, Bevington, says in the section in here dealing with Shakespeare's family, personal life, he essentially says, we don't really know how serious Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, was about his religious beliefs. I would encourage you, and I used to assign this, but it's become almost impossible to get in the United States, so I can't anymore. Look at, you can get it on Amazon, but the bookstore can't buy from Amazon. Go figure. You can get anything from Amazon, and they can't buy from it. Look at Michael Wood's In Search of Shakespeare. You can also get on YouTube and watch a BBC adaptation. It's like a 4-hour long, the thing. The book's an expansion, essentially, of it. In what Wood does, and I think he does it very conclusively, he's a PhD in history from Oxford. So he's not just, Joe Blow, this is my website kind of a thing. I think he shows pretty conclusively if Shakespeare personally wasn't an adherent to Catholicism, his parents definitely were. And I think he makes a pretty strong case. Shakespeare was a closet Catholic all throughout his life. And we'll talk about differing, Protestant versus Catholic ideas in some of the plays, especially things like Hamlet and As You Like It. They're just riddled with Christian language. Not religious language, Christian language. Merchant of Venice is riddled with Christian and Jewish, showing, Shakespeare's not just some closet Catholic who wants to beat everybody over the head, with Catholicism. He couldn't because he would have been in trouble. 42 articles. I know I have another. Yeah. 1588, Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada, the attempt by Philip II of Spain to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth, is kind of the straw that breaks English Protestants' back. What do I mean by that? After 1588, you get this huge anti-Catholic backlash. How huge and how backlashing is it? Parliament passes laws. I don't think it's 1588. I think it's the very early 90s. Parliament passes laws where it is a capital offense to be a Catholic priest in England. That is, to just be a priest, not to be celebrating Mass, just to be a priest and in England is enough to warrant your death. Okay? And we know of priests who were captured and executed and such. Okay? If you ever saw, I think it's the last James Bond film, Skyfall, And they got they're at the beautiful old house, and they find a little hidden compartment. And there's a door, and it's got a tunnel leading away, and it's described as the priest's hole. Well, that's where the priests would go. That's where the priest would go when the Protestants come to beat down the doors. And notice, it opens up way away from the rest of the house. Okay, that's so that they can get far away. Those things are all over, those little priest holes. What was it? There was something discovered related to Shakespeare about a dozen years ago. And I think it was related to one of the Shakespeare houses. It might have been his actual birthplace house, where a compartment was found, like in the wall, and they thought it was a priest's hole, not in the sense of this is where a priest would hide, but this is where a priest might put a crucifix, a cross, or a document. Okay, so 1588. What is the Spanish Armada? Does anybody know? Does everybody know? I should put it that way. I know you know because you heard it. Spain sends over 300 galleons fighting ships of war to invade England. It's thought, take it back, it's not thought, we know. This was planned with people in England, Roman Catholics in England, in northern England. Okay? Problem is, those Spanish galleons were almost entirely destroyed by a hurricane or by winds. Okay? Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake, they did defeat some of them, but not many. But of the 300 that set sail, I think only something like 30 returned to port. Okay? Well, you live in a time period that is, let's see, how do I put this? That takes everything as occurring, everything that occurs as being symbolic. That is, everything is interconnected. Interconnected what? With the will of God. So everything that happens, there's a reason for it. Might not know the reason, but there is a reason for it. So, your arch enemy, ISIS, gets ready to invade. Let's say you're not going to hijack 4 planes, you're going to hijack 50. And those 50 planes are coming to the United States. And they're not all with passengers, they're all with 500 pounds of nuclear bombs or something. And they all blow up midair before they reach the United States airspace. And it has nothing to do with our military. They just, even today, which is not a quote-unquote age of faith, a lot of people go, wonder why that happened. Well, this is an age of faith. Everybody, nearly, was a believer of one form or another of Christianity. Okay? Hard to argue against this sign. The dirty, rotten Catholics got what God had coming to them. So what does that then say about your monarch? God favors her. And she gets a new nickname, Gloriana. She of utmost glory. Woo, And we start hearing people talk about, the God anointed, etc., etc. Well, what else starts happening? I mentioned this kind of was the straw that broke the Protestants' back. Huge backlash, laws passed against them. Catholic writers getting hands cut off, tongues cut out, etc., etc., fleeing England. Okay. Meanwhile, let's say 1588, and this, so she becomes queen when she's in her 20s. 1588, that's 30 years after this, so she's in her 50s and she still doesn't have any kids. And they don't have modern science like we've got grandmothers having babies today in their 60s. Didn't happen then. So beginning in the 1580s, there starts to be this undercurrent of concern. Who's going to be king or monarch after her? Nobody knows. See, early, she's young, she's vivacious, she's smart as all get out. Elizabeth was brilliant. And so what does she do? Oh, there's King Philip II of Spain. not the greatest looking guy, but King of Spain. She reels him in a little bit, lets him go back. Oh yeah, here's somebody over here too. And she starts playing them against each other, as well as a couple of English, dukes, nobles, etc., Earl of Leicester and such. She dies without heir. When she dies, very, very, very few people, I think only the Privy Council, know what's been planned. Well, you got to understand a little bit about English history. How do the English and Scots get along? Like the NAACP and the KKK. They don't mix very well. Why? Because England keeps trying to take over Scotland. And the Scots keep fighting them off. Even today. One time I was in London, it's World Cup. Mother of all get out, battles. England versus Scotland. England won. There was another World Cup. It was England versus Germany. The Scots cheered for Germany. They're part of the United Kingdom. Supposedly been united, since 1710. So, she dies, King becomes King of Scotland. James is Protestant. He fancies himself an intellectual. He likes stuff about demons and witches. He writes a book on demonology. Because of him, Shakespeare writes Macbeth. We know that almost entirely. He wrote Macbeth to please the Scottish king. It's about the Scottish king. Okay. 7 minutes. 1582, Shakespeare marries Anne Hathaway. He gets a license from the bishop, which isn't required. But the license from the bishop is so that the banns don't have to be read. What are the banns? 3 successive Sundays. The priest of the local parish where you're going to be married stands up in church and says, come to my attention, Will and Anne are going to be married. Any reason anybody here knows why they shouldn't be? That is not, because she's old and he's young and hot. No. Yeah, because she's a slut. Yeah, because he's a gigolo. That's a reason. That's not done. Okay? Pretty standard practice in the English church. That's done each Sunday over 3 successive Sundays. Now, there are some reasons the New Text mentions why the bishop might readily not do that. Say you want to get married and it's during Advent, November 15th to Christmas. Well, generally, you don't get married during that period. So you want to get married just before Advent. Well, if you have to read the 3 banns, 3 successive Sundays, that pushes you into Advent. Now you got to get married after Advent. Same thing with Lent. So the bishop might say, cool, we'll only do it one Sunday. Okay? They don't have to have the banns read. Well, lo and behold, looky there. Just a few months later, like 3, their eldest daughter is born. We're obviously talking shotgun wedding. They don't get married in Stratford. We don't know exactly where they got married. Your book mentions a possibility. Wood actually does give a pretty good reason for a location. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. Okay? A couple years later, they then have twins, Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet has nothing to do with the character named Hamlet, probably named after neighbors. Hamnet and Judith, I don't remember the last name, Evans or something like that. Okay? And then Shakespeare seemingly drops off the face of the earth. Because after the mention in the birth certificates of Hamnet and Judith, we don't hear anything about Shakespeare. There is no documentary evidence whatsoever until he's referred to in 1592 in London. Referred to by name. Okay? Your book mentions some interesting theories. One of the very earliest ones, and it comes from about 100 years after Shakespeare, is that he was a schoolmaster. But there's no proof. Another one, he was a traveling player, actor. No proof. Another one is that he was apprenticed to somebody as a, I don't remember, butcher or something like that. No proof. Another one is that he traveled the continent. No proof. We have no idea. All we know is that in 1592, he is referred to as an actor and playwright in London. Okay? So, that means he definitely has to have been there for longer than just a day or even a year. He's probably been there since at least 1590. Okay? And he's also probably been writing plays. And your book goes into, quite a bit, some of the earlier plays and when they were probably written and who they were probably written for in terms of players' companies, Pembroke's Men, things like that. Okay? We do know 1594 to 1603, he's part of the Lord Chamberlain's men. Now, who's the Lord Chamberlain? Essentially, the second most powerful person in the realm. Okay? After the king or queen. So what's it mean to be one of the Lord Chamberlain's men? The Lord Chamberlain is their patron. Along with patronage comes protection. That is, because he was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's men, Shakespeare and the other members of the troupe were afforded a certain amount of protection from other individuals. Because once they saw that you were wearing the livery of the Lord Chamberlain, that is the uniform of the Lord Chamberlain, what's that kind of like? Well, it's kind of like a key. It opens and closes doors. So that others would, be a little bit deferential. Actors were not held in high repute. Actors, man, that's kind of low-life stuff. All right? So, 1594 to 1603, member of the Lord Chamberlain's men. 1603 until he leaves London, he's a member of the King's men. There is still a Lord Chamberlain, but what happens? The king becomes their patron. And we know during this period, much more so than this period, they put on a whole bunch of private performances for the king and for the king's household. They did some for Queen Elizabeth. We know that. We've got accounts. We have written records of that. Lord Chamberlain's men performed for, Her Majesty at blah, 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 blah. We've got diary entries. We've got other things that give us a whole lot of information about Shakespeare's plays and when they were performed and what was performed. We know specific days, specific times, in the evening on. Okay? If it's in the evening, it's at an indoor theater. Why? The Globe did not have outdoor lighting. So all of Shakespeare's plays that were performed at the Globe were daytime performances. And they had to start so that they would finish in such time that it would not be dark on stage before the end of the play. Which means, for most of them, probably 4 hours before sunset. Because once the sun dips down over the roof of the building, the open side, okay, it starts to get dark in there pretty fast. Real quickly, 1576, James Burbage erects a theater, a building, northeast London, outside the city limits, and names this thing the theater. It's the only one at this point. Okay? He builds it on leased land. In 1599, the lease comes due. So, he, James Burbage, his sons, Cuthbert and Richard, who are all part of the Lord Chamberlain's men. All right? Cuthbert's the stage manager. Richard is the greatest actor of his generation. They and the rest of the Lord Chamberlain's men decide to take down the Globe and to take down the theater and reconstruct it south of the Thames. And when they do that, they give it a new name. It's the exact same building, exact same structure, exact same dimensions. One night they take it apart, because if they don't, it becomes the property of the guy who owns the land on which it's built. So they take it apart, They take it down south of the tomb. It gets re-erected, and from then on, it's called the Globe. Okay, it's 11:06, so we will stop there. So, for Tuesday, Richard III. If there's a quiz, it'll be over what we talked about today, and if anything from Richard III, the first 3 acts. I don't know that there will be, but